I remember the silence first, not the music drifting faintly from the chapel below, or the muffled laughter of guests trying to guess whether my family had simply been delayed. It was the silence inside the bridal room that lodged itself in my chest like a stone. I sat there in my wedding gown, hands trembling slightly against the satin fabric, watching the clock inch forward, while the empty chairs in the front row waited for people who were never coming. Every tick of the second hand felt like a reminder of what I already knew deep down. My family had skipped my wedding. Not one message, not one call, not even a lazy excuse. The wedding coordinator poked her head in at one point and asked gently if my parents were parking. I nodded because admitting the truth out loud felt too humiliating to bear. When the door closed again, the silence rushed back in and wrapped around me like a cold blanket. It was strange how familiar that cold felt. It reminded me of another moment years ago when I was 12 and locked outside in the backyard for half an hour because I had spilled my father's glass of sweet tea. I remembered standing barefoot on the freezing concrete, hugging my arms around myself, listening to my father's voice through the kitchen window, while he told my mother that I needed to learn consequences. My mother did not open the door. She simply watched from the sink until my shivering stopped. Moments like that shape you quietly. Or the time when I was 16 and my father grabbed my wrist so tightly that I felt pins and needles shoot up my arm because I had talked back when he accused me of lying about a school project. I was not lying, but truth never mattered in our house. What mattered was obedience, control, silence. I never called the police because the idea of exposing my family terrified me more than the bruises that bloomed beneath my sleeves. I was financially trapped, emotionally conditioned, and my mother always whispered the same warning whenever I grew too bold. She would take my hand, squeeze it a little too hard, and whisper, "Do not provoke your father." Those words echoed in my head, even in the bridal room years later while I waited for a family who never intended to arrive. My fiancé, Evan, knocked before entering, careful not to startle me. He took one look at the empty chairs and then at me. His expression softened the way it always did when he realized I was holding myself together by threads. He sat beside me and squeezed my cold fingers. "You do not have to pretend you are fine," he whispered. But I did pretend. Pretending had been my survival for so long that dropping the mask felt impossible. When the ceremony began, I walked down the aisle alone. Guests smiled gently, assuming it was a modern choice, or perhaps a tribute to independence, but my heart ached with every step. Evan waited for me with steady eyes, and when he whispered, "I am right here," it nearly broke me. After the reception, after the dances and the photos and the toasts that tried to fill the empty spaces left by people who chose absence, we returned to the hotel suite overlooking the city. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my gown, staring at my phone as if it might suddenly light up with an apology that would never come. My eyes were swollen from tears I had tried to hide. Evan turned on the television to distract me, but instead, the banner across the news channel stole my breath. Monroe Serenity Retreats reaches $460 million valuation. My company, my work, my name. Reporters were discussing my expansion, my innovative wellness model, my leadership. For a moment, I forgot the ache in my chest. Then my phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it would not stop. 27 missed calls stacked across the screen. 3 from my father, 4 from my mother, 7 from Derek, 13 from relatives who had not spoken to me in years. Suddenly, everyone remembered my name. Suddenly, everyone cared. I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring through fresh tears, and whispered to myself the truth that struck deeper than any childhood bruise. They had not come to my wedding. But the moment $460 million hit the news, suddenly my entire family remembered I existed. People often say that every family has its problems, but the Monroe family hid ours behind polished Sunday smiles and perfectly ironed church clothes. Outsiders saw a respectable suburban household in the quiet outskirts of Salem, Oregon, where neighbors waved from trimmed lawns and fathers washed their cars on Saturday mornings. They saw my father, Michael Monroe, shaking hands firmly with the pastor and volunteering for community events. They saw my mother, Susan, bringing homemade pies to potlucks and complimenting everyone's children while pretending hers were just as adored at home. They never saw the tightness around her eyes whenever someone asked about me or the way her hand twitched when my father's voice deepened slightly, as if a storm cloud had rolled into the room without warning. Inside our house, everything shifted depending on my father's mood. If he walked through the door with calm footsteps, we ate dinner in relative peace. If he slammed the door or loosened his tie too quickly, the entire evening rearranged itself around his temper. He never needed to yell to make a point. His silence was sharper than shouting, and the look in his eyes could freeze air. He was the kind of man who expected obedience without question, who believed love was earned through compliance rather than given freely. I learned early that my safest place was the background. My mother played the dutiful wife, always smoothing over his edges with explanations that sounded like excuses. "Your father is stressed. He works hard. He has a lot on his mind." She repeated those lines so often they felt like a family motto. She never raised her voice, but she knew exactly when to stay quiet. She mastered the art of stepping between us only after the damage was done, offering a lukewarm towel or a whispered apology on his behalf, then urging me not to make life harder for him. Her softness was confusing, a cotton blanket placed over barbed wire. She loved me, I suppose, but her love bent toward fear. Instead of protecting me, she protected the image of our family patching over the cracks so the outside world would never see the fractures splintering beneath the surface. Derek, my older brother by 3 years, filled the golden boy role with the ease of someone who had never been punished for anything real in his life. He was the star shooting guard at our high school, graceful and charismatic with a smile that charmed teachers into overlooking missed assignments. Our father adored him. He bragged about Derek at work at church, even at the grocery store once, telling a cashier that Derek would play Division I basketball and make the Monroe name proud. I stood beside them holding a bag of apples invisible. Derek understood his power in the family and used it well. When he shoved me or mocked me or blamed me for things he had done, my father waved it away. "Boys will be boys," he said. When Derek broke a picture frame during a fight and blamed me, I spent an hour cleaning up shards while Derek played video games in the next room. In our home, blame rolled downhill and landed squarely at my feet every time. I became the scapegoat, the designated target for every bad mood and disappointment. If my father had a bad day at work, I was the problem. If Derek ruined a school project, I had distracted him. If my mother forgot an appointment, I should have reminded her. Even the tone of my voice was scrutinized. Do not sound defensive. Do not sound emotional. Do not sound ungrateful. In a house full of people, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Living in suburban Oregon made our dysfunction easier to hide. The houses were spaced far enough apart that no one heard raised voices or hurried footsteps. The neighbors saw us leave every Sunday morning for church in coordinated outfits. They waved, admired the tulips my mother planted, and assumed everything was as neat as our front lawn. People in our community valued appearances, and my parents excelled at presenting the perfect facade. Behind closed doors, the perfection rotted. My father controlled finances with iron precision. Every receipt allowance and expense funneled through him, making it impossible for me to have independence. My mother managed the emotional climate, tiptoeing between us to keep the peace. Derek carried the trophy child glow, never questioned, always praised. I lived in the shadows, absorbing blame, smoothing conflict, disappearing when necessary. Growing up in that environment shaped me in ways I would not fully understand until adulthood. I learned to read the sound of footsteps, to gauge the weight of silence, to anticipate anger before it erupted. I learned that speaking up could earn a cold stare or a painful grip on the wrist. I learned that being good did not mean being loved. Our family dynamic was a cycle reinforced daily. My father demanded control. My mother enabled it. My brother benefited from it. And I survived it. Outsiders would have been shocked if they knew the truth. But the truth was something our family buried deeper than anything else. I spent years believing I was the problem, that if I were smarter or quieter or more obedient, my father might soften, my mother might defend me, and my brother might see me as more than a punching bag for his frustrations. But loyalty in a toxic family is not real loyalty. It is fear dressed up as devotion. And despite the smiles we displayed to the world, fear ruled our home long before I was old enough to name it. Childhood is supposed to be a place where memories soften with time, where the edges blur until only warmth remains, but mine stayed sharp enough to cut well into adulthood. One of my earliest memories of my father's temper came when I was 9, standing in the kitchen with a ruined group project trembling in my hands. I had accidentally spilled juice on the poster board, smearing the carefully drawn timelines my classmates and I had worked on for days. When my father saw the disaster, he grabbed the front of my shirt and yanked me closer, his fingers brushing my collarbone as he demanded to know why I always messed things up. His voice was low-controlled, the kind that terrified me more than any shout could. My mother stood at the counter, pretending to rinse vegetables, refusing to intervene. I apologized over and over, but apologies never mattered in that house. All that mattered was his disappointment. Another memory clung to me like a bruise that never fully faded. I was 11 and Derek wanted the television remote. I was in the middle of a show, something harmless and forgettable, but Derek marched over, grabbed my wrist, and twisted until a sharp sting shot up my arm. I cried out and he loosened his grip only after taking the remote triumphantly. When our father asked why I was whining, Derek smirked and blamed me for being dramatic. My father clapped him on the shoulder and told him he needed to toughen up for basketball season. I stood there holding my aching wrist, hearing the unspoken message more clearly than anything. Derek mattered. I did not. What haunts me most is not the physical pain from moments like that, but the steady erosion of being unseen. My mother was the quietest participant in my suffering. When I cried, she often walked past me without pausing, as though acknowledging my pain might unravel something she worked tirelessly to hide. She perfected the art of tending to wounds without naming their cause. If my wrist was swollen, she wrapped it gently but insisted we tell the school nurse I had fallen. If I flinched when someone raised a hand near me, she would sigh and remind me not to bring tension into the house. Her neglect was not loud, but it was constant, a soft pressure keeping me silent. On the rare occasions when I asked why she never defended me, she said that good daughters do not stir up conflict and that I had to understand the expectations placed on our family. Expectations became chains. I learned that emotions were dangerous. Joy could be mocked. Sadness could be punished. Anger could ignite my father's temper like a spark near gasoline. I practiced smiling in the mirror so I could maintain it when my stomach knotted with fear. By the time I was 13, I had become the unofficial peacekeeper absorbing blame before it reached anyone else. If Derek failed a class, I apologized for distracting him. If my mother forgot a church meeting, I said I must have heard the wrong time. If my father exploded over something trivial, I accepted responsibility to prevent Derek from getting dragged into it. My survival strategy was simple. Be quiet. Be small. Be useful enough to avoid notice, but not so useful that I overshadowed the favored child. People sometimes imagine abused children constantly begging for rescue, but the truth is more complicated. I rarely considered calling the police because I believed chaos at home was somehow my fault. My father had connections in town from his years working in construction and volunteering at local events. The idea of challenging him felt impossible. I feared no one would believe me, or worse, that exposing the truth would unleash something far more dangerous. My mother's warnings echoed every time I considered speaking up. Do not provoke your father. You know how stressed he gets. He works so hard. We should be grateful. She layered guilt over fear until I could no longer separate the two. I grew up believing that keeping the peace was my job, even if it meant sacrificing myself in the process. Yet there were brief glimmers of hope that flickered through the darkness. A kind teacher who said I had talent for organizing events. A librarian who let me stay until closing so I did not have to go home to an unpredictable evening. A neighbor who once asked if everything was all right after hearing raised voices through the walls. I always smiled and said yes, even when my stomach twisted with dread. Hope came in small doses, but pain returned in waves. I tried to impress my father whenever possible. I brought home report cards filled with A-grades trophies from school competitions, certificates for perfect attendance. He barely glanced at them. Derek could come home with a C- and be praised for balancing sports and academics. No matter what I achieved, I remained invisible. That invisibility burrowed deep into me, teaching me that love had conditions I could never meet. The emotional seesaw of my childhood shaped something fierce inside me, a yearning not for their approval, but for escape. I spent years telling myself that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and never stepped out of line one day, my father might soften, my mother might choose me, and Derek might respect me. But those moments never came. Instead, the more I tried to earn their affection, the more hollow the effort felt. Betrayal became routine. Abandonment became normal. And somewhere in that tangled mess of longing and disappointment, I realized that surviving my childhood required disappearing inside myself, storing pieces of who I was in places no one in that house could reach. I did not yet know that one day I would retrieve those pieces and build an entire life out of them, a life so large and luminous that the people who once ignored me would try desperately to step back into its glow. But before that happened, I had to endure the years that taught me exactly what I never wanted to become. Turning 17 felt less like stepping into adulthood and more like reaching the edge of a cliff I had been pushed toward my entire life. By then, I had become an expert in navigating my father's moods, ducking verbal blows, and quietly absorbing the weight of Derek's arrogance. I had learned to read danger in the tight set of my mother's jaw, in the way she smoothed her apron when she sensed tension gathering in the air. Still, a small, stubborn ember inside me refused to die. It flickered whenever I imagined a different life, one where my days were not dictated by fear, but by something that felt like purpose. That ember grew brighter the day a guidance counselor at school suggested I look into hospitality management programs. She told me I had a natural talent for organization and leadership, that I made people feel grounded when I worked with them. I remember leaving her office with a pamphlet tucked carefully inside my notebook and a sense of possibility blooming in my chest. I should have known that hope in my family was dangerous. That night during dinner, I gathered my courage and told my parents I wanted to apply to a hospitality management program after graduation. My father barely glanced up from his plate before letting out a cold laugh that carried more contempt than words ever could. "You in business," he said with a smirk. "Do not be ridiculous." Derek snorted into his mashed potatoes, adding that I would last 5 minutes before falling apart. My mother avoided my eyes, busy cutting her chicken into tiny, perfect squares. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but forced myself to keep my voice steady. I told them I had researched the program and that it aligned with what I wanted for my future. My father finally looked at me, then his eyes narrowing as though I had insulted him by dreaming beyond the boundaries he had set for my existence. "You think you can make it out there," he said slowly. "You can barely manage yourself in this house." The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulling taut. I swallowed hard and told him that maybe the reason I struggled was because I was constantly told I would fail. That was the moment everything snapped. My father shoved his chair back so violently that the legs screeched against the tile. Before I could step away, he grabbed my arm near the shoulder and pushed me backward hard enough that my heels slipped on the edge of the carpeted stairway behind me. I did not fall far, only 3 steps, but the jolt rattled my spine and sent a wave of panic through my chest. My mother gasped, but instead of rushing to help me, she hurried to my father's side and placed a trembling hand on his arm. "He did not mean it," she whispered, even though he had not apologized, even though he had not looked at me, even though I was the one sitting on the steps trying to catch my breath. Derek stood at the base of the stairs, arms crossed, watching with mild interest, as though witnessing the humiliation of his sister was nothing more than a brief interruption to his evening. I pulled myself up slowly, not because my body hurt, but because something deeper inside me was beginning to shift. In that moment, the truth settled into my bones with chilling clarity. My father would never see me as anything other than a problem to control. My mother would never choose me over him. My brother would never see me as anything but someone to mock. Waiting for them to love me was like waiting for winter to bloom into roses. I made it to my room without another word. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the pamphlet the counselor had given me. I traced the college logo with my fingertip as tears blurred the ink. For years, I had believed that if I simply behaved better, worked harder, or swallowed my hurt more quietly, maybe my family would soften. Maybe I would finally become worthy of their attention. But being pushed down those steps made something inside me snap into place. Not with anger exactly, but with resolve. I realized that if I stayed in that house, I would vanish into the wallpaper of my own life. I would become a shadow of a person molded by fear and guilt until there was nothing left but obedience. I could not let that happen. So I began quietly preparing for escape. I saved the small amount of cash I earned cleaning houses on weekends. I collected clothes, toiletries, and the important documents I could find. I researched scholarships and filled out applications in the school computer lab because I knew my father monitored our home internet history. The night I finally left, I waited until everyone went to bed. My heart thudded so loudly I feared it might wake them. I slipped out the back door with only a backpack and $28 folded in my pocket. I did not look back at the house that had built me and broken me. The air outside felt cold but freeing crisp with a promise I had never known before. As I walked down the dimly lit street away from the life that had taught me how to survive but never how to live, I whispered the words that would shape my entire future. If I stay, I will disappear. Leaving was the first decision I ever made purely for myself, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Starting over at 17 with nothing but a backpack and $28 felt like stepping into a world that was both terrifying and strangely weightless. For the first time in my life, every decision I made was mine alone, and that freedom pulsed through me like a heartbeat. I took the first bus heading toward the Oregon coast because it was the cheapest fare I could afford. I sat near the back forehead, pressed to the cool window, watching the dark highway unspool beneath the streetlights. The farther the bus traveled from Salem, the more my chest loosened, though a faint ache still lingered like bruises beneath the skin. I arrived in a small coastal town called Seabrook just before sunrise. The air smelled of salt and cold mist, and gulls cried overhead as if greeting me into a life that did not yet exist. With no place to go, I wandered the streets until I found a rundown motel with a flickering vacancy sign. Desperation overrode fear, and I stepped inside to ask if they were hiring. The night manager, an older woman named Patty with deep lines around her eyes, looked me over thoughtfully. She seemed to understand I had nowhere else to go. She offered me a graveyard shift as a front desk attendant paid in cash every Friday. It was not glamorous or even kind, but it was a start. I slept in a small storage room behind the laundry area, curled up on a thin blanket. The whir of washing machines became my lullaby. Every night I greeted late-arriving guests, checked in truck drivers coming off long hauls, and listened to the static hum of the motel lobby television. Working at the motel taught me more about people than school ever had. I learned to read exhaustion in slumped shoulders, recognize loneliness in hesitant smiles, and understand frustration in clipped tones. Some guests were kind, leaving a couple of dollars in the tip jar or thanking me for staying awake during storms. Others were impatient or angry, as though the worn carpets and flickering lights were personally offensive to them. I absorbed their moods without protesting, still trained to avoid conflict. But my new world did not let me stay invisible for long. One night, a drunken guest stumbled to the front desk, slurring at me for not giving him a discount he insisted he deserved. When I refused, he grabbed my arm with a familiarity that jolted a buried instinct. For a split second, I was back in my father's house, trapped by a grip I could not escape. But something had changed since leaving. Instead of freezing, I pulled my arm sharply away and stepped back with my voice steady as I told him I would call the police if he did not let go. He blinked, surprised, and shuffled away toward his room. My whole body trembled afterward, but there was a victory in that moment, a hint I was not the same girl who once endured everything in silence. During the days I was not working, I researched hospitality basics on the motel computer and borrowed books from the local library. I learned about customer service strategies, room turnover systems, marketing approaches, and what made independent lodges succeed. I asked Patty questions constantly, studying how she managed shift schedules, handled upset guests, and balanced the harsh reality of running a business on razor-thin margins. She did not mentor me intentionally, but I absorbed everything I could. By 19, I had saved enough money to rent a small studio apartment with peeling paint and a faulty heater, but it was mine. I decorated it with thrift store furniture and a plant I was determined to keep alive. Having my own space felt like reclaiming parts of myself I did not even know I had lost. Yet despite the progress, loneliness often crept in during quiet mornings. I had no family to call, no safety net to fall back on, and no familiar voice to reassure me I was on the right path. Those were the moments when doubt whispered that maybe my father had been right about me. Maybe I would fall apart. But every time that doubt rose, I forced myself to remember the night I left home, the jolt of determination that carried me out the door, and the knowledge that disappearing was no longer an option. One rainy afternoon, while flipping through classified ads, I saw a listing for a lodge outside Portland that was close to foreclosure. The property was old, and the photos online showed sagging beams, mildew stains on the walls, and carpets worn down to threads. But something about the listing tugged at me. It reminded me of myself in a way, damaged but still standing, waiting for someone to believe in its potential. I took a bus to see it in person. The place looked even worse than the pictures, but I felt a strange pull as I walked through the empty lobby, tracing my fingers along the dusty reception desk. Maybe it was foolish, but for the first time since running away, I felt a spark of ambition that stretched beyond survival. The bank manager who oversaw the foreclosure process raised an eyebrow when I asked about purchasing it. "You are awfully young to take on a project like this," he said. I told him I was not afraid of hard work. He smirked and replied that hard work was not the problem, money was. I left his office with another stack of pamphlets and the same stubborn resolve that had fueled me since 17. I would find a way, even if it meant starting from zero yet again. Buying the failing lodge outside Portland felt impossible at first, like trying to catch sunlight with bare hands, but once the idea took root in me, I could not shake it. I spent weeks running numbers on scraps of paper, researching grants and small business loans, and emailing anyone who might know something about reviving a dying property. Most people ignored me. A few responded politely before telling me I needed more experience, or more capital, or simply more years behind me. Their doubt echoed the voices from my childhood, but now those echoes fueled me instead of weakening me. I refused to let the past dictate the boundaries of my future. Eventually, I found a community loan program that supported young entrepreneurs in rural Oregon. They were not convinced by my minimal savings, but they were intrigued by my persistence and the months of research I had compiled. After 3 interviews and a detailed proposal that I rewrote at least a dozen times, they approved a small loan that barely covered the cost of purchasing the lodge. It was enough. I signed the papers with shaking hands, half terrified, half electrified. When I first stepped into the lodge as its owner, the place felt like a wounded animal, broken and neglected, but still alive. The air smelled faintly of mold and old pine. The wallpaper peeled like curling petals. Windows rattled when the wind blew, but beneath the decay I saw potential, a quiet promise of what the lodge could become if someone cared enough to restore it. I spent the first week cleaning non-stop. I scrubbed mildew from bathroom tiles until my knuckles stung. I ripped up wet carpet and hauled it out to the dumpster behind the property. I swept dead leaves from the entryway and washed grime off every window until my arms ached. At night, I collapsed onto an air mattress in one of the cleaner rooms, too exhausted to dream. Yet despite the exhaustion, I felt more alive than I had in years. During daylight hours, I continued the work. I learned to patch drywall from online videos, slowly smoothing the walls into something presentable. I repainted the lobby in soft earth tones, hoping to create warmth where coldness once settled. I replaced outdated light fixtures with simple modern ones I found secondhand. The transformation was slow, uneven, and often frustrating. Some days I questioned whether I had taken on more than I could handle. But every time doubt whispered, I imagined the lodge bustling with guests and laughter, a refuge for people who needed healing. That vision kept me going. Hiring help was out of the question because I could not afford a staff yet. I handled every task myself, from scrubbing toilets to learning the booking software that came with the property. My mistakes were plentiful, and I carried bruises from accidentally bumping into furniture while dragging it across hallways. Still, each small improvement felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. Not everything about the early days was inspiring. One night, while I was painting the hallway, a guest who had wandered in from the nearby tavern appeared in the doorway. He reeked of alcohol and slurred compliments that made my skin prickle. When I asked him to leave, he stepped closer and reached for my wrist. The grip was not as painful as it was familiar, echoing memories I had worked hard to bury. But unlike the frightened girl I once was, I stood my ground. I twisted my arm free and told him firmly that the police were a 3-minute call away. For a moment, he looked surprised, almost offended that I did not recoil. Then he muttered something and staggered back outside. My heart pounded afterward, but I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold. I was no longer the child who accepted harm as fate. I was building a life where I chose my boundaries. After months of relentless work, the lodge finally opened its doors under a new name. Monroe Serenity Lodge felt like a dream spoken aloud for the first time. The early guests were few, mostly hikers passing through or couples seeking a quiet weekend away. But each person who walked through the doors welcomed the change. They complimented the cozy rooms, the clean scent of cedar, and the peaceful atmosphere. Those small bits of validation stitched courage into my spine. I used guest feedback to refine the lodge even more. I added meditation corners, soothing lamps, and handmade herbal teas I sourced from a local farmer. Slowly, the reviews began to grow. Travelers praised the peaceful environment and the thoughtful details. They described the lodge as a place where they felt genuinely cared for, and each kind word felt like a salve over old wounds. The emotional seesaw of building a business was relentless, but for once, the highs outweighed the lows. I was still learning, still fumbling through unexpected challenges, but I was moving in a direction that felt wholly my own. And even though the lodge was still far from profitable, I sensed the first real whisper of success in the air. A whisper that told me I was no longer running from my past. I was building something powerful in spite of it. The rise of Serenity Retreats did not happen overnight, but looking back, it feels like the world shifted beneath my feet in ways I never could have predicted. The first lodge had barely begun to stabilize when word of mouth started weaving its quiet magic through Oregon's coastal and mountain towns. Guests who had stayed only a night returned weeks later with friends and stories of how peaceful the space felt, how the air inside the lodge seemed different, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves exhaled calm. I had not crafted any grand marketing plan beyond a simple website and a few social media posts, mostly because I could not afford anything more elaborate. But authenticity spoke louder than any advertisement. People came because they felt seen. Guests told me I remembered their names, paid attention to their preferences, and offered small comforts without being asked. Those details were not marketing strategies for me. They were survival techniques I had learned in childhood, the instinctive awareness of moods and silent needs. Now, for the first time, those instincts helped rather than hurt me. When the lodge reached consistent occupancy, I reinvested every dollar into upgrading the property. I added a small yoga room with soft lighting and warm wood floors. I expanded the outdoor seating area with handmade benches I sanded and stained myself. I collaborated with local artisans to showcase pottery candles and woven blankets, turning the lobby into a gallery of Oregon craft. The atmosphere transformed from a once neglected building into a sanctuary. Guests described it as a refuge from the noise of the world, a place where they could breathe without apology. The success of the first lodge gave me the courage to pursue a second property, this time a mountain cabin resort outside Bend. It was another fixer-upper, but I had experience now. I walked through the snowy grounds, imagining nightly fires in stone pits, morning hikes to catch pink sunrises, and quiet evenings with soft music drifting through rustic windows. Securing funding was still a battle, but lenders hesitated less once they saw the glowing reviews and the upward trend of bookings. With the loan approved, I spent months traveling between Portland and Bend, juggling renovations, training a small team, and barely sleeping. Yet exhaustion felt different now. It was not the heavy, suffocating fatigue of surviving my childhood. It was the purposeful kind, the kind that follows a day of meaningful labor. When the second location opened, occupancy numbers climbed faster than I dared expect. Guests loved the mountain serenity, the sound of wind whispering through pines, and the thoughtful touches I infused into every corner. A travel blogger stayed for a weekend and wrote an article calling Serenity Retreats one of Oregon's most promising wellness havens. That single feature brought a flood of new guests. Soon after, a local news station covered the story of a young woman revitalizing forgotten properties into restorative spaces. Watching that segment online, hearing the reporter commend my vision, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not pride exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement that I had once been a girl no one believed in and was now a woman building something people traveled miles to find. Expansion became both a thrill and a burden. The third location near the Columbia River Gorge required more strategy than sweat. I hired my first true management team, trusting others to maintain standards I had once guarded obsessively. Delegating felt like stepping off a ledge. I had never relied on anyone growing up, and depending on strangers triggered an old fear that everything could collapse if I stopped holding all the weight myself. But I also knew resilience meant learning to let go. Each manager I hired brought skills I did not have, from operations expertise to customer experience design. Together, we sharpened the Serenity Retreats model, refining everything from the check-in process to the scent profile of each room. As the company grew, so did its identity. Serenity Retreats became known not just for hospitality, but for healing. Guests often confided that they came during breakups, burnout, health scares, or family turmoil, and left feeling restored. I did not advertise it that way, but word spread naturally. People returned because they felt safe in a way they had not felt in years. Understanding pain had become my business advantage, though I rarely admitted that aloud. By the time we launched the fourth location, a lakeside property in Washington, Serenity Retreats had caught the attention of regional investors. They approached cautiously at first, curious to understand how a young woman with no formal business background was scaling at such a pace. I told them the truth. I built things people needed, not things that looked impressive on paper. Investors appreciated the clarity. They also appreciated the numbers. Occupancy rates were high. Guest satisfaction exceeded industry standards. Revenue grew steadily month after month. The brand had captured a niche no one else bothered to fill, a space between luxury and genuine human care. With investors on board, we expanded operations, refined branding, and developed long-term plans for national growth. Somewhere between those meetings and property renovations and endless nights reviewing budgets, I realized I had built something far larger than a business. I had built a life I once believed impossible, a life I chose, a life where my name meant something other than burden. Yet even as Serenity Retreats soared, shadows from my past lingered at the edges. Sometimes while reviewing financial reports late at night, I wondered whether my father or mother ever saw the news stories, whether Derek ever recognized the name on the billboards near Portland's airport, whether any of them felt even a flicker of curiosity about the daughter they had dismissed. But I never reached out. Success had not healed the wounds they left behind. It simply gave me new ground to stand on. And standing on that ground, watching Serenity Retreats rise higher each month, I finally understood that the greatest triumphs are not loud. They are quiet, steady, built from every choice to keep going when the world once told you to sit down and disappear. The day Serenity Retreats reached a valuation of $460 million did not begin with fireworks or confetti or any cinematic moment you might expect from such a milestone. It began quietly, with gray morning light slipping through the tall windows of our Portland headquarters and the faint hum of construction outside as workers renovated the new rooftop deck. I had arrived earlier than usual, long before anyone else, partly out of habit and partly out of an unease I could not quite name. My office overlooked the river, and watching the water drift steadily past always steadied something inside me. I sipped coffee that had already cooled and opened my laptop to review expansion projections when the door burst open. Elena, my CFO, stood in the doorway with her hair slightly disheveled and her breath unsteady, as if she had sprinted the entire length of the hall. She held a folder in her hand, clutched so tightly the edges had curled. "Alexis," she said, her voice wavering between disbelief and exhilaration. It came in. My pulse fluttered painfully. For months we had been preparing for the valuation assessment, gathering data, refining presentations, and answering endless questions from investors. I thought I was ready to hear the number, but when Elena handed me the report and I saw the figure glowing up at me, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. 460 million. The room felt suddenly too small, too bright, too real. I stared at the number again, as if waiting for it to rearrange itself into something more familiar. I sat down slowly, afraid my legs might give out. Elena hovered near the desk, wringing her hands, her eyes wide with pride. "You did this," she said. "We did this." I corrected gently, though deep down I felt something else entirely. Something quieter and heavier than triumph. Memories of my childhood surged up uninvited and unwelcome. My father brushing off my accomplishments. My mother telling me not to cause trouble. Derek laughing whenever I dared to want something more. Those voices had shaped the earliest part of my life, but they no longer defined it. Now their absence echoed differently. Elena continued speaking, outlining what the valuation meant for our next phase, how investors would respond, what opportunities the new figure unlocked. I heard only fragments as her words blended with the sudden buzzing of notifications exploding across my phone. News outlets pushed alerts announcing our valuation. Emails poured in from partners, journalists, potential collaborators, and former colleagues who had once dismissed me. The buzz grew louder and faster until it felt like standing beneath a swarm of digital bees. I forced myself to breathe. Focus. Celebrate. You earned this. But celebration felt distant. What I felt instead was a strange stillness, as if time had paused long enough for me to understand I was now standing at a summit I had once believed unreachable. Elena sat across from me and whispered, "Alexis, this is life-changing." I nodded, but the words that slipped from my throat were not the ones she expected. "They are going to call." She frowned. "Who?" I hesitated, though we both knew the answer. "My family." Elena's face softened with understanding. She knew bits of my past enough to grasp why the thought both terrified and infuriated me. As if on cue, my phone vibrated once. Then again. I ignored it, eyes fixed on the valuation report, but dread coiled in my stomach. The buzzing continued relentlessly as if the phone itself were panicking on their behalf. I finally picked it up, the screen blazing with alerts. Dozens of congratulatory messages from people I barely knew. Invitations for interviews, requests for quotes, all layered over a string of missed calls from unknown numbers. And then I saw it. The name I had not seen on my screen in nearly 3 years. Michael Monroe, my father. The air left my lungs. Before I could react, another call came through. Susan Monroe, my mother. Then another. Derek. The final blow came from a number saved only as Aunt Marianne, a woman who had once told me privately not to embarrass the family with my ambitions. In all, 27 missed calls flashed across my screen, a digital resurrection of people who had ghosted me long before the term became popular. Elena watched me carefully. "Do you want to answer?" I shook my head once firmly. The office suddenly felt suffocating, so I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the river flowed steadily indifferent to everything happening on the 32nd floor. Looking down at the city, I felt a mixture of power and vulnerability swirl inside me, a feeling I had not been able to name until now. Power because I had built something monumental. Vulnerability because the people who hurt me most in life were about to try to step back into it. When I finally found my voice, it was quiet but steady. They did not come to my wedding. They never called during the hard years. They never once checked if I was okay. And now, Elena nodded slowly. Now they remember you. I turned away from the window, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers tingled. The truth settled over me with chilling clarity. They had not called out of love or concern or remorse. They had called because $460 million had entered the conversation. They had called because success had made me valuable in their eyes. And for the first time since childhood, I realized I no longer felt the need to be chosen by them. I had chosen myself. The first call came just after lunch while I was in a meeting with our operations team discussing expansion plans for a new wellness cabin concept. The phone buzzed on the table beside me, vibrating insistently until the entire metal frame hummed. I ignored it, keeping my eyes on the presentation, but I felt the tight coil in my stomach forming again. When it buzzed a second time, Elena glanced at the screen and raised her eyebrows in warning. I did not need to look to know who it was. My father had never been the type to give up after one attempt, especially when he wanted something. By the time I stepped out of the meeting, my phone showed 9 missed calls, 5 voicemails, and a barrage of text notifications lighting up the lock screen like fireworks. For a moment, I simply stood in the hallway, gripping the phone so hard my palm ached, staring at the familiar names that once defined my entire world. My father had sent a short message. Dinner tonight. Family matter. No greeting. No explanation. Not even my name. The same clipped tone he used when assigning chores or demanding obedience. He spoke as if time had not passed, as if we were still living under his roof, and I was still required to fall in line without question. My mother's text came next. "Alexis, please come. Your father wants to talk. It is important." There was no mention of my success or the valuation or the years she had watched my number flash across her phone without ever answering it. Just a quiet summons disguised as concern. Derek, on the other hand, did not bother with politeness. "Call me now. We need to discuss something." Then another text. "You owe the family a conversation." I stared at the words until my eyes blurred, trying to understand how people who had not cared if I survived or starved or disappeared suddenly believed I owed them anything. Still, curiosity tugged at me. Not about what they wanted. I already knew the answer to that. But about who they would become now that they believed I was valuable. When I finally opened my voicemail, my father's voice filled the speaker. It was startling how familiar it sounded, the same clipped enunciation, the same undertone of authority. "Alexis, this is your father. We need you at dinner tonight, 7 o'clock. Do not be late." As if I had been waiting all these years to jump the moment he snapped his fingers. My mother's voicemail came next. Her voice trembled with manufactured softness. "Sweetheart, please listen to your father. Things are difficult right now. We are all under a lot of stress. We need you with us." The final message was from Derek. No pretense, no softness, just a demand. "You cannot ignore us. Family sticks together." My breath caught at the hypocrisy. Family had never stuck together when it came to me. I thought back to birthdays spent alone in my room, to school plays where an empty seat silently mocked me, to years when I begged for someone, anyone in that house to choose me. None of them had, not once. But now, with millions attached to my name, they wanted access to a version of me they never helped build. I locked the phone and sat on a bench outside the building, the autumn wind brushing against my face. The city hummed around me, unaware of the emotional fault line splitting open in my chest. I knew I did not owe them anything. I knew answering their calls would be walking willingly into the same emotional quicksand I had spent years clawing my way out of. But I also knew something else. Something I did not want to admit even to myself. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to see how they would look at the daughter they had ignored when she stood in front of them, not as a frightened girl, but as a woman with power they could not control. The thought settled into me like a stone. This was not about reconciliation. This was about closure. I went back inside and found Elena in her office reviewing financial reports. She looked up immediately when she saw my expression. "They contacted you," she said gently. I nodded. She hesitated, then asked the question I was already grappling with. "Are you going to see them?" The answer formed slowly but firmly. "Yes." Elena set her pen down carefully. "You do not owe them anything," she reminded me. "I know," I said quietly. "I am not going for them. I am going for me." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I sat in my car outside my apartment building, staring at the series of text notifications piling up again. My mother had sent several messages asking if I was coming. Derek sent another curt reminder. My father sent nothing further confident his first command was enough. Their predictability was almost comforting in a twisted way. I knew exactly who they were. And now, for the first time, I knew exactly who I had become. I typed a single message into the family group thread. "I will be there at 7. The moment I hit send, a strange calm settled over me. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something deeper, a readiness to face the ghosts I had once run from. Because no matter what happened at that dinner, one truth was already undeniable. They had not come to my wedding. They had not come when I was struggling to survive. They had not come when I begged silently for love. They came now for money, and I would finally see them clearly for who they were. I arrived home an hour before the dinner, hoping to shower and change into something that made me feel composed, but the moment I stepped out of the elevator, I saw a familiar figure leaning against my door. Elena stood with a folder tucked under her arm, her expression tight, the kind of expression she wore only when she carried news heavy enough to shift the ground beneath someone's feet. I froze my hand, still hovering near my keys. Elena straightened and said softly, "Alexis, we need to talk before you go." My pulse quickened. It was rare for her to show up unannounced, rarer still for her to look rattled. She held the folder toward me, and there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. I unlocked the door and motioned for her to come in. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies dread. I watched as she laid the folder on my kitchen counter and opened it with the caution of someone revealing a wound. What she showed me made my breath hitch. Inside were financial statements, foreclosure notices, bank warnings, contractor lawsuits, and overdue tax documents, all tied to one name, Michael Monroe, my father. For a moment, I could not speak. My eyes skimmed the pages, each line painting a picture more devastating than the last. He owed money to multiple private lenders. His properties were collapsing in value. A half-finished real estate project outside Salem had drained him financially. He had defaulted on 3 major loans. One of his buildings had been seized by the county. Another was days from foreclosure. My father, the man who measured his worth in control and status, was drowning under millions of dollars in debt. Elena exhaled slowly. "I had our team run a quiet background check after you mentioned the calls this morning. I wanted to understand why he suddenly reached out." I swallowed hard. "And this is why." She nodded. "Alexis, your father is months away from losing everything." I stared at the documents, disbelief mixing with something like bitter inevitability. The man who once lectured me about responsibility, who mocked my ambitions, who insisted I would fall apart without him, had been unraveling behind the scenes for years. But instead of humbling him, instead of making him face his failures, he had turned to the daughter he once discarded. My throat tightened. "Does he know you pulled these records?" I asked. "No," she replied, "and he never will unless you tell him." I paced the room slowly, my mind racing. Growing up, my father had always presented himself as unshakable, a pillar of authority no one dared challenge. Seeing evidence of his desperation felt surreal, like watching a myth collapse. I pressed my palms against the countertop and whispered, "He does not want me. He wants salvation." Elena hesitated. "There is more." She slid another stack of papers forward. "These belong to your brother." Derek's name appeared across pages filled with lawsuits, negligence claims, and failed business filings. A sports training facility he tried to open had closed after 6 months. A partnership deal had ended in a legal dispute. He owed tens of thousands to contractors he never paid. And then there was the worst of it. A personal loan backed by one of my father's commercial properties that Derek had quietly taken out and defaulted on. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Both of them are sinking." Elena nodded gravely. "And they believe you can pull them out." I laughed softly without humor. It made perfect sense. They did not see me as family. They saw me as a lifeline with a price tag. I dropped into a chair, pressing my hands to my forehead. Anger pulsed through me, sharp and electric, but beneath it was something deeper, something more painful. A question that had haunted every chapter of my life. Why was I only worthy when they needed something? Elena sat across from me, her gaze steady. "Alexis, you need to go into that dinner understanding exactly what you are walking into. They are not reaching out because they miss you. They are reaching out because you are their last hope." I knew she was right. I had known it from the moment the first call came through, still seeing the hard evidence stripped away any doubt. My father had not suddenly regained conscience. My mother had not rediscovered maternal instinct. Derek had not grown a sense of family loyalty. They were sinking, and I was the only floating object within reach. But something else stirred within me as I flipped through the documents again. Not pity, not fear, clarity. For the first time, I saw my father's power for what it had always been: fragile, inflated, dependent on the silence of the people he controlled. And suddenly, the grip he had once held over my life felt smaller, weaker, almost pathetic. Elena watched me carefully. "What are you thinking?" I closed the folder and met her eyes. "That I am going to walk into that dinner tonight. And for the first time in my life, I will not be the one afraid." She nodded slowly. "But be prepared. They will not tell you the truth." "Then I will tell it for them," I replied. I stood, grabbed my coat, and took one last look at the documents spread across my counter. Years of hidden failures. Years of secrets they never thought I would uncover. Years of believing I would always remain the powerless one in the family. But not tonight. Tonight I would face them not as the daughter they had dismissed, but as the woman whose success they now depended on. And they would finally understand the price of abandoning me. I drove to the office after Elena left because I needed movement to clear my thoughts, needed fluorescent lights and the steady hum of computers to replace the ringing in my ears. The documents she had shown me replayed in my mind like a cruel montage. My father drowning in debt, Derek tangled in lawsuits, my mother pretending ignorance stitching denial into every corner of her life, and above all, the truth that pulsed louder than my heartbeat. They were not reaching for me. They were reaching for rescue. I walked into the empty conference room and stood before the wall of glass overlooking the river. The city lights glittered across the surface like scattered gold. For years, I had wondered what power felt like. Not the superficial kind that men like my father clung to, but real power. The kind built from surviving, from refusing to break, from turning wounds into something unshakable. Standing there, I felt that power settle over me like armor. I could help them. Yes. I could write a check, wipe their debts, give them a chance to rebuild. But the thought of doing so tightened something behind my ribs. They had never lifted a finger for me. Not when I scraped together coins to buy groceries. Not when I lived in a storage room behind a motel lobby. Not when I worked double shifts or patched moldy walls alone at night. Not even on my wedding day. They had abandoned me in every way that mattered, and now they expected devotion simply because we shared blood. I pressed my palms against the cool glass. Helping them would not heal me. It would chain me to them again, reopen the wounds I had fought so hard to close. No. If they wanted something from me, then they would receive it on my terms, not theirs. The thought emerged slowly, forming with the precision of a blade. I could buy their debt, all of it. Every loan, every foreclosure notice, every pending lawsuit tied to their names. I had the capital. I had the connections. And more importantly, I had the will. Buying their debt would not be vengeance in the way people imagine vengeance. It would be reclaiming the pieces of my life they once controlled. It would be placing the power that had once been used to hurt me fully and finally in my own hands. No shouting. No threats, just truth backed by financial reality, revenge by power, a quiet kind, a lasting kind, a kind they would never see coming. I turned from the window and walked toward my desk with determination crystallizing inside me. Elena had stayed late, typing furiously in her office. When I stepped into the doorway, she looked up with concern, bracing herself for whatever decision I had made. I held her gaze. "I want to buy it. All of it." She blinked. "You want to buy your father's debt portfolio? And Derek's. Every lender. Every outstanding balance. Every property tied to collateral. Secure it all under Serenity Holdings." Elena set her pen down slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to awe to something resembling fear. "That is going to cost millions, Alexis. Tens of millions." I nodded. "I know." She studied me carefully. "You understand what this means. Buying their debt means legally taking ownership of their obligations, their properties, their leverage, everything they have left." I met her gaze steadily. "Good." Elena stood walking around the desk to face me fully. Her voice softened. "This is not something you can undo once the wheels start turning. If you buy this debt, your father will not see it as help. He will see it as an attack." I inhaled quietly. "He attacked me my entire life. He just used different weapons." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I will contact the lenders. Most of them will sell quickly if the portfolio is distressed. You will have to sign everything within 48 hours. I will be ready." Elena hesitated before asking the question lingering behind her eyes. Alexis, are you doing this out of anger? The honesty settled over me like a breath of cold air. No. I am doing it because I am done being powerless. That answer seemed to ground her. She returned to her chair, pulled up the files, and began sending messages to the lenders involved. Each keystroke echoed in the room like the tolling of a new beginning. I watched her work, feeling a strange calm spread through me. This was not rage. This was reclamation. Years of silence and smallness and forced obedience finally unraveling into purpose. I drove home afterward, the night air sharp against my skin as I stepped from the car. The city felt different somehow, as if the streets themselves recognized the shift forming inside me. I entered my apartment and looked again at the folder Elena had brought. The papers no longer felt heavy with dread. They felt like opportunity, evidence, leverage. Closing my father's chapter would not come through screaming or accusations. It would come through signatures and contracts, through systems he once weaponized against me. When I finally sat down and allowed myself to breathe, I understood something I had never understood as a child. Revenge does not always arrive through fire. Sometimes it arrives through ownership, through the simple act of refusing to be the one who kneels. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early because I needed to see the space before they saw me, needed to feel the ground beneath my feet and steady my breathing before stepping into the storm I knew waited on the other side of the door. The restaurant was a semi-fancy place downtown, the kind my father used to brag about taking clients to when he wanted to project success. Soft amber lights glowed from chandeliers overhead, casting warm reflections across polished wood floors. The hostess looked up as I approached, her polite smile faltering slightly when she asked for the reservation name, and I answered Monroe. It was strange hearing it aloud, strange letting it roll from my tongue without flinching. She led me toward a private dining room near the back, each step echoing like a countdown. When she opened the door, 4 heads snapped toward me. My father sat at the head of the table in a dark suit, though the shoulders sagged slightly as if it no longer fit him. My mother sat to his right, fingers wrapped tightly around a cloth napkin. Derek slouched to his left, tapping impatiently at his phone. My Uncle Mark, whom I had not heard from in years, occupied the last seat, glancing between everyone, like he was unsure whose side he belonged on. The room smelled of expensive wine they probably could not afford, and desperation they did not try to mask. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression practiced as if he had rehearsed this moment and expected me to fold instantly. "You are late," he said, though I was not. I arrived exactly when I intended to, choosing my tone with precision. My mother flinched as if she recognized something new in my voice, something she had not taught me to bury. "Sit," my father instructed, gesturing toward the empty chair. "We have things to discuss." I remained standing long enough to see irritation flash across his face. Then I took the seat, not because he commanded it, but because I chose to. For a moment, no one spoke. Derek cleared his throat and attempted a smile that came out more like a grimace. "Congratulations on your business success," he said, though the words were clipped and begrudging, scraped from a throat unused to sincerity. I nodded once. "Thank you." My father folded his hands on the table. "You have built quite an empire. I am told your valuation reached an impressive number. 460 million. My mother offered a brittle smile. "We are proud of you, sweetheart." The lie slid between us like smoke. They had not been proud when I left home. They had not been proud when I scrubbed motel floors to survive. They had not been proud when I slept in a storage room or worked double shifts. They were proud now because they needed something. My father leaned forward. "We called you here because the family is facing challenges." That was his word for it. Challenges. As if foreclosure notices, lawsuits, and millions in debt were minor inconveniences rather than the crumbling ruins of the empire he claimed to have built with discipline and grit. Derek jumped in first. Dad's real estate projects were hit hard, the market turned, and some investors pulled out. "We just need a bridge to stabilize things." A bridge. A polite word for bailout. My mother nodded, eyes shining with the kind of performative sadness she used whenever she wanted sympathy. "Your father has been under tremendous stress. Everything he built is at risk. We need your help to get through this." She looked at me as if expecting me to reach across the table and comfort her the way I used to when I was too young to understand the manipulation woven into her gentleness. I let the silence hang until the air felt thick. My father finally said it outright. Your company has the resources to support the family. We believed it was time you contributed. Contributed. As if I had not contributed enough by surviving the childhood they subjected me to. As if abandoning me at my wedding had slipped their minds. As if my success was a communal achievement instead of a solitary one. I kept my voice level. And what exactly are you asking? My father gestured vaguely. A loan. A partnership. Whatever form you think best. The important thing is that we maintain control of our properties. Derek nodded vigorously. We can rebuild everything. We just need you to help us back on our feet. Help your family, my father added, as if the word alone should have been enough to make me surrender. I studied their faces, the familiar mixture of entitlement and expectation. For years, I had tried to earn a place at that table, to be seen as someone worth loving. Now, sitting before them as a woman who no longer needed their approval, I saw them with startling clarity. They did not love me. They needed me. My father's jaw tightened when I did not respond immediately. Alexis, he said slowly, this is a critical moment. We cannot survive without your support. Tell us what you need from us to proceed. The question was almost laughable. What I needed from them had never been something they could give, but the terms they feared most were already in motion, tucked away in documents they did not know I controlled. Their debt was no longer owed to banks or private lenders. It was owed to me. They just did not know it yet. For a long moment, I let the room sit in thick, uncomfortable silence, the kind that exposes every crack in a person's confidence. My father's gaze sharpened with impatience. Derek shifted in his chair, like a man waiting for a verdict he assumed would favor him, and my mother dabbed the corner of her eyes with a napkin she had not actually used for tears. I folded my hands on the table, mirroring my father's posture, not out of imitation, but out of intention. You said you want to know what I need in order to help, I began calmly. All three of them straightened as if finally hearing the answer they believed they were entitled to. My father nodded once. Yes, state your terms. I reached into my bag with a deliberate slowness and placed a thick envelope on the table. On the outside, it looked plain and unassuming, but the weight inside it pulsed like a quiet detonation waiting to be released. My father looked at it with suspicion. What is this? I slid it toward him. Information. His fingers hesitated before pulling out the stack of documents, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. Derek leaned in to see his expression shifting from arrogant expectancy to confusion. My mother held her breath, watching my father's reaction to determine her own. My father read the first page, then the second, and then he froze entirely, shoulders stiffening as if struck by a physical blow. What is this? He whispered, but there was no authority in his voice this time, only fear. Derek snatched a document and scanned it quickly, his face drained of color. These are our loan statements. How do you have these? I kept my voice steady. Because I bought them. The air inside the room collapsed into an invisible vacuum as the truth settled. My father looked up sharply, eyes narrowing in disbelief. You did what? I met his stare without flinching. Every outstanding loan, every piece of collateral, every lien, every debt tied to your businesses. And yours too, Derek. All of it now belongs to Serenity Holdings. Derek stumbled over his words. That is not possible. Lenders would never sell that fast. They would if the borrower is desperate, I replied. Especially when the borrower has been ignoring payment demands for months. My father slammed the stack of papers onto the table, the sound cracking through the room. You had no right to interfere in my affairs. My heart beat steadily, not fast, not anxious, only certain. Your affairs were already collapsing. I simply purchased what was available. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You think this gives you power over me? I leaned back slightly. No, it gives me clarity. My father's voice rose. You mean to humiliate me, in public, in front of my family. I kept my tone calm. No, I mean to tell the truth you refused to tell. My mother finally found her voice soft and trembling. Alexis, honey, you do not understand what your father has been dealing with. The market downturn affected everyone. We did our best. I turned to her slowly. Did you? Did your best include ignoring foreclosure letters, evading contractors, pretending everything was fine while forcing everyone around you to play along? Her lips quivered, but she said nothing. I shifted my attention back to my father. You summoned me here assuming I would save you. You assumed my success was something you could claim ownership over, but the only reason I survived long enough to build anything was because I left you. Derek stepped forward, pointing a finger at me. You cannot just take our properties. You cannot just own our debts. I shook my head. I did not take anything. You forfeited it by not paying what you owed. He glared at me with pure resentment. So what now? You want us homeless. You want to ruin us. I exhaled slowly. No. I want accountability. My father's fists clenched at his sides. You ungrateful child. After everything I did for you. That sentence, the one he had weaponized my entire life, no longer pierced me. Instead, it rolled off my skin like water. You did not raise me, I said quietly. You controlled me. You belittled me. You hurt me. And when I finally found happiness, you did not even show up. My father's face twisted not with shame, but with fury. He leaned across the table, jabbing a finger toward me. I am still your father. You will speak to me with respect. I stood slowly, letting the chair slide back behind me. Respect is earned, not enforced. A dangerous silence followed. My father stepped closer, towering over me in a stance he had used many times to intimidate me. His voice dropped to a low threat. You think you can walk in here and dictate the future of this family. You think your little business makes you powerful. I did not move. I simply lifted the final paper from the envelope and placed it between us. It was the official transfer document showing Serenity Holdings as the secured creditor on all of his outstanding obligations. My father stared at it, the color draining from his face. For the first time in my life, he looked small. I spoke with absolute clarity. I am not dictating your future. I am informing you of it. The room felt frozen, every eye locked on me. My voice did not waver. You skipped my wedding. You skipped the moments that mattered. You made it clear I did not belong to this family. But make no mistake, your debts belong to me now. My father staggered back a step as if the truth itself had struck him. Derek muttered a curse under his breath. My mother covered her mouth, finally understanding the magnitude of what had unfolded. And then I said the words that severed the final thread between us. You do not get to summon me anymore. My father stared at me as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he was still deciding whether to fight the fall or surrender to it. His breathing grew uneven, the muscles in his jaw tightening the way they always had before something snapped inside him, the way they had when I was a child and made the mistake of being too visible or too quiet or to myself. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he stepped toward me slow and deliberate, as though closing the distance between us might magically restore the power he once held so easily. You think this is over, he growled. You think you can walk away from this family and pretend you were not raised under my roof. My pulse quickened, but I did not move. I had spent most of my life shrinking back, making myself small so that his rage had somewhere else to go. Not now, not ever again. He came closer until I could feel the heat of his anger in the air between us. You will fix this, he said through clenched teeth. You will undo whatever stunt you just pulled. You will not speak to me like I am some failed man begging on the street. I kept my chin lifted. You are not begging on the street. You are standing in front of the daughter you ignored for 27 years. My father's face contorted. Derek moved behind him, rubbing the back of his neck as though debating whether to step in. My mother whispered, Michael, please sit down, but her voice came out thin and trembling, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime pretending she could calm a hurricane by speaking gently to it. My father ignored her. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist the same way he had when I was 16, the same way that burned into my memory like a brand I never asked for. The pressure was sharp, intended to dominate, to remind me who he believed he still was. My breath caught, but I did not recoil. Not this time. "Let go of me," I said quietly. My father tightened his grip instead. "You listen to me, young lady. You will correct this. You will show respect. You will remember your place." Something inside me clicked. Not fear, not panic. Something steadier, colder, like a locked door opening after years of rusted hinges. I looked into his eyes, not with pleading, not with the desperation of a girl who wanted her father to love her, but with the clarity of a woman who finally understood the truth he had spent my entire childhood convincing me not to see. I reached up with my free hand and peeled his fingers off my wrist one by one, prying them away with a calmness that made his eyes widen. "Touch me again and I will press charges." My father stumbled back as if the words had shoved him harder than any physical force could. "Charges," he repeated, voice cracking with disbelief. "Against your own father." "You made that choice a long time ago," I replied. He looked at me as though trying to find the daughter he believed he still controlled, but all he found was someone who had outgrown the smallness he forced her into. Derek stepped forward, suddenly pointing at me with shaking hands. "This is insane! You cannot destroy us because you are angry about the past. You think you are better than us now?" I turned to him. "This is not about the past. It is about the consequences of choices you and Dad made. Choices with money. Choices with people. Choices with me." He flinched at the last word. My mother reached across the table with shaking hands. "Please, Alexis, please stop this. Families do not do this to each other. They protect each other." I stared at her, remembering every time she told me to be quiet, to endure, to forgive, to keep the peace that only she benefited from. "You protected him," I said. "Never me." My mother pressed her trembling hand against her lips as if the truth were physically painful. My father straightened again, breathing hard, struggling to regain the authority that kept slipping from his grasp like sand through clenched fingers. "You will regret this, Alexis. You will regret turning your back on the people who raised you." I shook my head slowly. "You did not raise me. You survived me. There is a difference." The silence that followed was heavy and final. Something shifted in the room like tension snapping under too much weight. My vision sharpened, my heartbeat slowed. For the first time, I felt not fear, but release. My father drew in a long breath and said in a low voice, "Get out." Then louder, "Get out of here. You are no daughter of mine." His words came out like a blow, but they landed without pain. Instead, they clarified everything I already knew. I picked up my purse. Then I looked at each of them one last time. "You skipped my wedding. You skipped the most important day of my life. And now you want me to save yours. That is not how love works. That is not how family works." None of them spoke. They only watched. My father seething, my mother trembling, Derek silently calculating what this meant for him. I walked to the door, steady, calm, certain. When my hand reached the handle, I heard my father shout, "Alexis." I did not turn around. The moment I pushed the door open, the cold night air washed over me like a wave of freedom I had never known. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel chased by their voices or haunted by their expectations. I felt untouchable. The morning after the confrontation felt strangely gentle, as if the world itself had decided to show me what life could look like when it was not shaped by fear or obligation or the constant effort to keep other people calm. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the light barely brushing the edges of the curtains in my room at the Serenity Retreat flagship location, the one I had poured so much of my heart into that it sometimes felt like a physical extension of myself. For a moment, I simply lay there listening to my own breathing, realizing how different it sounded when it was not shadowed by stress or dread. I sat up, wrapped a soft shawl around my shoulders, and stepped onto the balcony that overlooked the property. The early morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and freshly turned soil from the gardens our staff tended every day. Below me, guests were beginning to stir. A couple walked the gravel path toward the meditation deck. A woman in a wheelchair was assisted by a therapist who helped her adjust her blanket as she gazed at the sunrise. A few birds fluttered overhead. It felt peaceful in a way that no part of my childhood ever had. As I watched the scene, something inside me settled. I had spent years trying to earn love that would never come, bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes until I could barely recognize who I used to be. But now, I stood taller, not because of the success or the valuation or the power, but because I finally understood that my worth had never depended on people who refused to see it. I went downstairs to the main lobby where the soft morning music played through hidden speakers, calming and warm. One of the receptionists looked up with a smile. "Good morning, Alexis. Quiet day ahead." I returned the smile and nodded. "Just how I like it." I walked through the property, slowly taking in every detail. The light reflected off the water in the courtyard fountain. Fresh towels sat folded near the yoga studio. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree we had preserved during construction. Each element reminded me that I had built a refuge not only for guests seeking healing, but also for myself. As I stepped into the main atrium, Elena appeared from the hallway holding a clipboard, her eyes bright with energy even before she finished her first cup of coffee. "Morning," she said. "You look better than I expected after last night." I breathed out a quiet laugh. "I think I do too." She asked if I wanted to review the final transition documents for the properties we acquired from my father. For a moment, the weight of yesterday drifted into my chest, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like closure. "Yes," I said. "Let us finish it." We reviewed everything meticulously. Every signature, every clause, every confirmation that Serenity Holdings was now the sole owner of the assets. When we were done, she placed the pen down and looked at me with an expression that held something like pride. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. "Really okay." I paused, then nodded. "Better than okay, actually." After she left, I walked back outside where guests were gathering for a morning workshop. One of them recognized me and waved hesitantly. "You run this place, right?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes, I do." She told me she had been staying at the retreat for 3 days and already felt lighter than she had in years. I thanked her and watched her join the others, realizing how powerful it felt to create something that helped people breathe easier. As I continued walking, I reached the far edge of the property where a newly renovated building stood. It used to be part of my father's collapsing portfolio, a structure he had neglected until it nearly fell apart. Now it was painted warm earth tones, the windows framed with natural cedar, the entrance adorned with handmade pottery from local artists. A new sign hung above the door. Serenity Wellness Center. I traced my fingers along the lettering. This was more than a business expansion. It was transformation. It was taking something once shaped by control and fear and turning it into a place that embodied safety and restoration. Inside, staff members were arranging cushions and aromatherapy diffusers for the first group session. I thanked them before stepping back into the courtyard. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I did not reach for it immediately. For once, I did not jump or brace myself for someone else's demand. When I finally checked it, the screen showed a voicemail from my mother. I hesitated before pressing play. Her voice was soft and broken. "Alexis, I do not know what to say. Your father is furious. Derek, too. But I hope someday you understand we were trying our best." My throat tightened, not from longing, but from the realization that for years I had mistaken her silence for sacrifice. They were not the same. I deleted the message without listening further. Not out of cruelty, but out of acceptance. Some apologies arrive too late to matter, and some wounds stop bleeding only when you stop reopening them. Over the next weeks, the work continued, but it felt lighter. The renovation teams sent updates. The wellness director proposed new trauma-informed programs. Guests left handwritten notes thanking us for creating a place they could finally rest. Each day, I felt another layer of my old life slip away. One afternoon, I sat by the lake at the back of the property, watching the sunlight scatter across the water in shimmering patterns. Evan joined me quietly, placing a cup of tea beside me. He squeezed my hand gently. "How do you feel?" he asked. I let the breeze lift my hair and watched a family of ducks glide across the surface of the lake. "Free," I said softly. "I feel free." He smiled and rested his head against mine. "They cannot hurt you anymore." And I knew he was right. Not because they stopped trying, but because I no longer needed anything from them. I had finally stepped out of the shadow I was born into and chosen myself. As the sun dipped lower, the sky filled with streaks of orange and gold. I took a deep, steady breath and whispered to myself words I had chased my whole life without knowing. Leaving was not losing family. It was saving my life. And for the first time, those words felt entirely true. If you made it this far into my story, I want to speak directly to you, because maybe you saw pieces of your own life between the lines. Whether it was a parent who loved only when it benefited them, or a family that showed up only when they needed something, or years of shrinking yourself just to keep someone else from exploding. Maybe you grew up believing that survival meant silence, or that endurance meant loyalty, or that being mistreated was simply the price you paid to belong. And if any part of that feels familiar, then I want you to hear this clearly. You are not alone, and you are not broken. You do not owe your life to people who only remember your name when they see a dollar sign next to it. You do not owe forgiveness to people who never apologized. You do not owe comfort to those who caused your wounds, and you do not owe your presence to the very people who made you feel invisible in the first place, countless viewers write to me, saying their entire childhood comes rushing back when they hear stories like this. The door slams, the shouting, the bruises that faded, but somehow never truly faded. The Christmas mornings ruined by rage, the birthdays nobody showed up for, the moments you prayed someone would finally say, "I see you and I value you. If that is you, then I hope my story gives you something small but powerful. The permission to choose yourself even if your family never chose you. It is not betrayal to walk away from people who hurt you. It is not disrespect to protect your peace. It is not selfish to rebuild your life in a place where no one screams at you or grabs you or tells you that your dreams are impossible. It is courage, the kind most people will never understand until they have lived it themselves. So here is what I want to ask you, and I hope you answer in the comments, not for me, but for yourself. Have you ever had a moment when you realized you deserved better? A moment when you finally saw the truth behind someone's excuses, a moment when you knew deep down that walking away might break you, but staying would destroy you. Tell me your city. Tell me your story, or just tell me you are still standing, because sometimes that alone is enough. And if you are still in the middle of it, still living with the weight of someone else's anger, or the silence of someone who should have loved you, please remember this. Your life does not end in their shadow. You get to rewrite it. You get to choose light over fear. You get to walk toward a future where your worth is not debated but believed. And if no one has told you this in a long time, let me be the one to say it. You deserve peace. You deserve safety. You deserve love without conditions, and you deserve a life that finally feels like yours.